Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's good to see you here. We are just waiting for a moment to let people filter through our doors. So thank you for joining us. It's turned out to be quite, at least where I am sitting, it's quite a sparkling June day, a bit soggy out after today's rain. But that speaks volumes. If you're here, we're happy to have you. Thank you. Before we get started, and while people are still filtering into the room, I just want to, aside from welcoming you, I will introduce myself. My name is Kelly Greenlee. I am the Community Outreach Librarian at Prince Memorial Library. And you are here for an invasive plants session, which is very interesting and very exciting. I've had a number of people inquire about this, so we're very happy that we can deliver this to you. I just want to draw your attention to, we are in a webinar right now. So that means that while you are all present, it's not a meeting format, so we can't see you, but you can interact with us through the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So if you might have to toggle your mouse a little bit, but if you do so, you'll find a Q&A icon at the bottom. If you click on that at any time during the session today, you can ask a question of us. We'll see that question come up and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the course of the time that we have together. So thank you. We appreciate that. I want to just take a moment to I'm assuming that if you're in an invasive plants session that you are somewhat of a gardener. And my hope is that when you do your gardening this spring and summer, and as you dig your hands into the soil, you will offer a moment or a thought of gratitude to the indigenous people, the Wabanaki people who have inhabited our lands for hundreds of years, and they've cared for it. And we are very grateful to them. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Gary Fish is the Maine state horticulturist. He's been in that position since 2015. He is also the longtime manager of pesticide programs for the Board of Pesticides Control. And he has been an on and off practicing licensed professional forester since 1985. Wow. And as if that's not enough of a life among plants, he is also a hobbyist landscape and nature photographer and has a shop on Etsy called Fish Photography. That's fish with a PH. I'm thinking that maybe he's a fish fan. I don't know, maybe.
Not
really. One thing I also want to add is that he is going to be in our area in the coming weeks. Gary is going to be offering a talk at the Maine Audubon Native Plant Sale in Falmouth this coming Saturday, June 11th. And he's also going to be at LL Bean on July 27th. So if you enjoy this talk and you want to spread the word, you can find Gary at those locations coming up. All right, I'm going to pass the wand to Gary. Thank you, Gary.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you for inviting me for tonight. And thank you all for coming and to listen. And I will basically be presenting a number of things, starting out with what makes a plant invasive, then move into, how did they get here? How do they move around? Then I'll go into a little bit about our do not sell list and the first plants that were put on that list back in 2018. And then after that, talk a little bit about the newer plants that were recently added by rule, but won't be in effect in terms of not being able to be sold until January of 2024. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. Okay, good. And let's hope that it will move. So let's start out with, that's again, I'm the Maine State horticulturist and a native Mainer. I grew up here and actually about an 8th generation Mainer, but I also have praise for those that came before us and work with the Wabanaki on the emerald ash borer, which is threatening the ash that they use to make their baskets, and have been to many programs with those folks. And I'm very concerned about the fact that they may lose a very sacred tree to this insect, which I will be talking about at LL Bean. So let's start out first looking at what makes a plant invasive. And, basically it's not native. That's first and foremost. Most of them are very opportunistic and can fill a void much faster than some of our native plants. Many of them are extremely fast growing and viney and really take over a site very quickly. Many of them produce copious amounts of seed, or they are able to root from many different parts of them, like something like knotweed, which any piece of the plant pretty much can root and start another plant. They can tolerate all kinds of conditions, and many of them will dominate sites that are very rare, with rare soils or rare plants and animals that rely on those. And for a lot of them, seeds can remain viable for many years in the soil. So it makes it very difficult to manage them in many situations, because you have to just keep at it for multiple years. One of the questions that I got pre this webinar was asking about something like poison ivy. Is that an invasive plant? And so you saw one of the first characteristics is that they're not native. Well, poison ivy is a native plant. And as you look at this slide, you can see the berries that poison ivy puts out, which are very nutritious for many wildlife species and an important source of food. You can also see that it's a pollinator plant. I took this picture at my camp in Mount Vernon, and you can see this bee coming in to collect pollen and nectar from the poison ivy plant. And then another one that a lot of people think might be an invasive plant is something called staghorn sumac. And some people think that that's the sumac that causes rashes like poison ivy, but it's not. It's a very good source of food for early spring migratory birds, especially the robins love to eat these berries that are kind of furry. You can also make a tea from it. These are native plants. They're not invasive, and they're in almost always very beneficial to our ecology and to our wildlife. Of course, they create some problems for people, and sometimes you want to try to manage them. But if you can leave them alone and keep them in areas where they don't become a problem in terms of getting a rash, it's best to just leave them where they are. So how did these invasive plants come to the United States and to Maine? Many of them were brought for our pleasure. They were brought here for horticulture because they were beautiful or they were easy to propagate. And many of them were, made popular by nurseries because they were easy to propagate and they could be sold for fairly low prices. Others were brought here for conservation purposes. Many of them were brought in to stop soil erosion or to provide buffers in areas where there were dust storms and things like that. And then others were just accidental. They were brought over on ships in their dunnage and other materials that were brought in the soil that were dumped in our bays or were brought to our different lands for even medicinal purposes, like something like the dandelion or those types of plants. And back when I was at the University of Maine in the late 70s and early 80s, I worked at the university for a few years, and I worked for an organization that was part of the wildlife program. And we were actually giving out these different publications, which were, basically inviting people to plant a number of these plants that we now consider to be invasive. So unfortunately, some of this was brought on by the government saying that These are plants that grow fast, and they do provide some sort of food for birds, but later on we found out that most of the food that they provided was low in nutrition and high in sugar, and actually caused problems for birds in terms of physical, getting diarrhea and problems like that. And then how do they spread? Well, first and foremost, we have planted them, and we've planted them in many areas, especially in southern Maine, central Maine, not quite as much in far northern Maine, but a lot of them got started because we planted them in our gardens. Then a lot of them move from seeds, either through attaching to animals or by flying in the wind. And then others are moved by plant fragments. Here you can see knotweed, which oftentimes is spread when the ice comes through and rips those plants apart, and it drags pieces of those plants down into another part of the river or the stream. Also, beaver tend to cut these, and so do muskrats. And when they cut these off, they go floating in the water and eventually come up on the shore and create new knotweed infestations. And it is one that is particularly bad for our rivers, because they channeled the rivers and create worse types of flooding than we would get if the water was able to go over the banks instead of being channeled so much. They're often in animal poop. So a lot of birds pick up the berries from something like barberry or buckthorn or the honeysuckles. They eat the fruits, and then the seeds go right through them, and they end up in many forested areas where those seeds land. And unfortunately, those plants tend to be tolerant of shade, and they grow in the understory of the forest. Others move from, as I mentioned before, water and wind, or on our shoes. We have to be cognizant of moving some of these invasive plants if we're hiking. I'm an avid hiker and mountain climber, and I try very hard to make sure that I keep my clothing and shoes clean when I go from one site to another. And the same thing goes if you've got your pet dog with you. They can be moving plants around, or they can be on your equipment. If you're a four-wheeler or a four-wheel drive enthusiast, you can pick up some of these seeds and propagules and spread them around that way. So what's so bad about these invasive plants? I know that a lot of people are concerned that we are concerned about invasive plants because they come from other places. They come from China, they come from Europe. I've been told that in some ways we're all being xenophobic. I don't really believe that. That's not what we're thinking about. We don't care where they come from, other than the fact that they don't fit into our habitats, and they do ruin wildlife habitat, and they definitely do prevent forest regeneration. Where I used to live in Wayne, in many of the forests, there was so much Japanese barberry, there was so much burning bush, there was so much of the honeysuckles, that in many areas, when they went out and harvested even a small amount of wood off from those woodlots, you would not see any trees grow back, because the sunlight never was able to penetrate down to where those seeds were for the trees. So they actually prevent forests from regenerating. Usually in Maine, as we go through forest succession, if you cut the forest in Maine, it comes back to forest. That's the way it's been for centuries. And these plants, unfortunately, break up that succession, and they hold it for a while, much longer than we would want them to. They also really disrupt recreational activities, something like the Oriental bittersweet, Asiatic bittersweet, whatever you want to call it. It vines, very strongly and goes across trails and makes it very difficult to do anything on those trails. Multiflora rose is another one that really gets into trail areas, and it's of course very barbed and very hard to get through, and creates a lot of problems. Some invasive plants, like the mustards, they change soil chemistry. So if you've got garlic mustard infestations, like I know one that's very, very large on the Kennebec River, close to where our offices are on the Amhi complex, that is extensive, and they change the soil chemistry and basically dominate that site because of the way that they have changed the pH of the soil and the characteristics of the nutrients that are in the soil. And unfortunately, they cost billions of dollars to control across our country. I think the last estimate was in the 500 billions for just the United States. So there's a lot of time and effort spent on trying to keep these invasive plants at bay so that we can preserve those wildlife habitats. And this publication that you see here, I made this for the flower show about 5 years ago. I think I made it available to the library. And, you know, one of the things that I guess I would reiterate from this is that something like barberry, it becomes even worse in situations where there are deer browsing, because the deer do not eat the barberry, but they eat everything else. And they eventually get to the point where there's so little for them to eat that they eat themselves out of house and home. And then the other thing about the barberry is that it creates the perfect environment for the small mammals that are the carriers of our ticks, and they're the reservoir for Lyme disease. So the barberry can actually be a tick magnet and create more problems with Lyme disease or babesia or anaplasma, all the different diseases that we are seeing vectored by the black-legged tick. So back in 2015, 2016, we started to work together with a stakeholder group. You can tell how old I am, with a stakeholder group that was very multifaceted, with folks from all different walks of life, to put together the initial list of plants that we put on what we call our do not sell list. And, you know, we don't want people to ask for these or try to buy these. They're illegal to sell or import into the state of Maine. And I will highlight a few of the ones that have been popular in the past, but you can see here, this is the list of 33 plants that have been on that list since 2018. They were initially made illegal to sell or import in January of 2018. Most of them were actually being regularly sold in some of our nurseries and other, you know, places where they sell plants. A few of them that you see that are in red with asterisks, they're what we call horticultural hitchhikers. They actually are found in pots or on the root balls of trees, and they are weeds that sometimes get into those plants. Unfortunately, recently, in the last 2 years, we found an infestation of Japanese stiltgrass near one of the nurseries that we've had for many years that actually has been transitioning out of business down in York County. And there are now, as far as we know, only 3 infestations of this grass, which is an extremely bad grass that gets into our forest areas and really takes over the forest floor. So the most popular invasive plants that we banned from the earliest time are probably these 4. Burning bush, I know we had a couple of questions about that. Japanese barberry, Asiatic bittersweet, and Norway maple. And looking, you know, more extensively at each one of these. So burning bush is one that is much loved. Yes, one of the questions was about buying a variety that may be less likely to be invasive. And there are a couple of them out there that have been shown to produce a lot less fruits, but none of them have been proven to be not invasive. In fact, we did have one of our nurseries that asked for an exemption to continue to sell Rudy Hag variety of burning bush, and we did allow them to sell the ones that they had been growing for many years. But if you look at the scientific data on that, basically they eventually start to produce seeds and maybe more seeds, and it only takes a few seeds from a few plants to start a new population. So in the end, the scientific group that is brought together anytime someone asked for an exemption decided that they would also become invasive and did not allow the continued sale of those. And it is a branching shrub. Usually in the landscape, it's kind of trained and pruned and cut back. Out in the forest, where it gets in very shady areas, it grows about 10 feet tall. It branches out very much. It can tolerate both full sun and full shade, and it is good for moist or wet soils. It will also grow in drier sites. It has those winged twigs, we call it winged euonymus as well. And there are alternatives to this. Something like highbush blueberry also gets a red color in the fall. And the advantage to this is that the burning bush does not host any of the caterpillars that our birds need. It is unknown by our native insects, whereas something like highbush blueberry is host to something like the yellow-necked caterpillar, which is very commonly used by robins to feed to their young. And then another one that you can use that doesn't get the red color, but gets a beautiful golden color, is the northern spice bush, which is the only host to the spice bush swallowtail, which is this really cute little caterpillar that looks like it has eyes on it. So there's real advantages to using these native plants over the burning bush. Looking at Japanese barberry, it's extremely invasive. It's probably one of the most invasive plants that we have in the state. It's still out there everywhere, and there's many different color phases. There's yellow, there's red, there's green, there's gold. There's lots of different colors of berries as well. And, it was used for years as a hedge because it's well barbed and, keeps people out of places where you don't want them. But there's alternatives to that. And it is a very arching shrub. It will actually root from the stems. They'll arch over and contact the ground, and you'll get a new plant from that. It's very shade tolerant. It's very large, very thorny, not eaten by deer, as I mentioned before. And it is a magnet for ticks. So you're providing the perfect habitat for the small mammals like the white-footed mouse that are the reservoir for Lyme disease and the host for the black-legged tick. Usually before they attack us as nymphs, they feed on those small mammals. And then as they turn to adults, they feed on us, but the nymphs get us sometimes too. Alternatives to barberry, something like red chokeberry, aronia, or black chokeberry, either one of them are extremely great plants. Waxwings love the berries. They're very nutritious for them. And for the black chokeberry, you can actually use that as a fruit for us. Or you could use something like the Carolina rose. That's a really beautiful native rose, really important to sweat bees and mining bees. A really good pollinator plant, as opposed to the barberry, which really isn't. Again, it's a plant that's not known by our native insects or our native birds. Norway maple, some people call it red maple. It comes in both green as well as crimson king, and even has variegated varieties as well. It is so invasive. In fact, the banks of the Kennebec River, where I'm near right now in my office in Augusta and down to Hollowell, are just almost 100% Norway maple now. And that really shouldn't be what's there. It really should be a whole variety of different trees that provide habitat for a lot of different animals. Norway maple is, again, not known by our native insects. It does not get fed upon, and it's not providing the food that they need. It is, of course, a canopy tree. It is very, very strong in terms of the dense shade that it provides. So once it gets started in a forest area, it tends to take over because there's so much shade underneath it. Oftentimes there's really no understory underneath it, so you don't get those spring ephemeral plants. It's a really potential problem. One of the easiest ways to tell that a Norway maple from a sugar maple is if you break the leaf off, you'll see a white milky sap. So again, it can have green leaves, it can have red leaves, but if you pull a leaf off and you see this white milky sap, it's a Norway maple. And that's not Norway, Maine, that's Norway in Europe. And it, in terms of alternatives, the true red maple, Acer rubrum, is a really good tree, many different varieties available now for different situations. The straight species is also an extremely good plant, very pliable, can grow in wet or dry sites. And it is a host to the lesser maple spanworm. Again, a very nice choice meal for many birds when they're trying to feed their young baby birds, as well as the sugar maple, which of course has many possibilities in terms of even producing maple syrup. And it's a host to the Cecropia caterpillar, which provides a beautiful moth and very good food for something like a chickadee. Asiatic bittersweet is one that has been sold in the past because of its fall berries, its winter berries, and it is something that people still are making wreaths out of, which we're really trying to get people to stop doing, because those wreaths can definitely end up being picked up by birds. The seeds are deposited and you get more Asiatic bittersweet. It is an amazing plant. It grows up the sides of trees and actually pulls those trees down. I've seen whole stands of white pine that have been completely annihilated by Asiatic bittersweet. You can always tell this plant, if you pull it out of the ground, you can see the very orange root at the end of the plant, gives it away. There is a native version of bittersweet, doesn't have that orange root. Its berries are at the tips of the twigs as opposed to up and down the whole twig. It has a lot of seeds, it's bird dispersed, and it'll also come from suckers, and any fragment of the plant can end up growing again. So if you ever pull these out, you need to kind of hang them in a tree to dry out as opposed to putting them on the ground, because they'll reroot. And here you can see, what they do to trees. I'm sure you've probably all seen it before. I've seen the bittersweet vines that are even as big as the tree. I mean, just huge. So they're not only choking it off, but they're also adding all this weight to the tree and pulling it down. And just an amazing plant, an amazing damaging plant. As I mentioned before, there is a native look-alike American bittersweet. And you can see, all the flowers and all the berries are just at the very tips of the branches. These are sold in a number of stores. We do check them out and try to make sure that they are selling the American version and not the Asiatic version. So alternatives to bittersweet. One that I love the most is Virginia creeper, which some people call an invasive, but it's a native plant that is extremely important to all kinds of wildlife and produces a good habitat. The berries, the blueberries, they're kind of small to see here, are well loved by the Cape May warbler, and a really important plant out there. I know that it can sometimes get out of hand and you may need to prune it back, but it doesn't create the same problems that the bittersweet does. Or something like winterberry gives you those red berries in the winter. You can use those as well in Christmas or holiday decorations. And it's a really important food source for the mockingbird. And it's a great plant for putting into areas where you may have a little bit of wetness there. It tolerates those wet conditions. Oftentimes you'll see it in wet ditches along the roadsides. Birds definitely love this one, and it provides that late season food and right through the winter. So it's important to prevent invasive plants. It's very difficult once they're there to control them and to manage them. We always say that we need to have early detection and rapid response. That's what we're trying to do with the stilt grass that I mentioned earlier. And ideally, first thing to not do is not plant them. And that's why they've been put on the do not sell list, so that people can't buy new ones and plant them in new places. So we want to slow the spread by keeping them out of new areas. As I mentioned before, cleaning off equipment or clothing or footwear, and minimizing soil movement and disturbances that can help to reduce the habitat or allow new seeding to come in. And if there are plant sales or things like that, it's best to bare root those plants and put them into new soil so that you're not moving native soil from one place to another that might be infested with seeds of invasive plants. Some of the newer invaders that we've been getting, some of them aren't as new as they used to be, but swallowwort is one that I'm sure that you've all seen in your area. It's extremely bad along the coast. Unfortunately, my daughter has it really bad at her house down in Brighton, Massachusetts. It's becoming a real sad story, and a lot of places where we're trying to protect important habitats. Our office is working on a biocontrol this year, doing experiments in a number of places with a hypena moth that we're hoping may help to slow it down. Stiltgrass is the one that I already mentioned. It was first found in Maine about 1.5 years ago, and we're trying to get right on top of it and stop it from moving. Ornamental jewelweed or Himalayan balsam, pink jewelweed, looks a lot like the touch-me-nots that we have that are orange flowered. It's extremely invasive, especially in kind of mid-coast Maine, but all throughout Maine now. Tree of Heaven is one that's really important because it's also the host for the spotted lanternfly, which is really bad in Pennsylvania. It's moved all the way up into Massachusetts now. We're hoping that it's not really going to be able to overwinter all that well in Maine, but it's the chief host for the spotted lanternfly. And one that was just put on our new list is the Callery or Bradford pear that has the white blossoms in the springtime and kind of smells funny, like dirty feet or something like that. That one has become one of the worst invasive trees ever, especially a little bit south of us in kind of the mid-Atlantic states, and as well as in Connecticut now and Massachusetts. We know of a couple fairly large populations now in the Portland area. So looking at black swallowwort, this is one that's a little bit like the bittersweet. It will vine up trees. It'll completely cover the ground and exclude all other plants. It's called black swallowwort because the flowers are kind of blackish, purplish in color. There's a pale swallowwort that has more yellower flowers. It has these leaves that eventually usually look kind of shiny and waxy, but when they first start to grow, they're not as waxy as that. The stiltgrass that I mentioned, one of the key characteristics of this grass is this silvery reflective hairs that are on the midrib of the grass. You can see how dense it can grow. It's called stiltgrass because it grows tall and then falls over and then reroots and starts another plant. It looks a lot like a couple of native grasses, and the difference between the two that's quick to tell is not only this reflective hairy midrib, but also if you pull your fingers up the stem of the plant, if you feel hairs, it's a native grass. If you don't feel hairs, it might be stiltgrass. Here's the ornamental jewelweed, a lot like our touch-me-nots, only it's pink or purple, and it's really taking over a lot of wetland areas in Maine, a lot of important habitats. So those are, some of the ones that are kind of newer to the state. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about newer plants that we just added to the do not sell list, which will not become banned until January 1st of 2024. And again, the way that we develop these lists is over many years to begin with. We have the Maine Natural Areas Program, which has a standing committee that looks at all the plants that are out there that might be considered invasive, and always doing research, looking for the latest publications on these plants to see if they might be a threat to the state of Maine. We also work with what's called the Regional Invasive Species, can't think of the risk network that's out of Cornell and the University of Massachusetts, which is looking at climate change and how that's going to affect some of the plants that may become invasive in Maine. One of the reasons why we looked at the Callery pear is that with climate change, it's only going to become a bigger problem in the state of Maine. And so we put together our diverse stakeholder committee again. They came to consensus on 30 new plants to be banned and 29 plants to go on a watch list, especially those that we think might be coming soon because of climate change or because of other issues. And then they also added rugosa rose as a special category, which I'll touch on a little bit. And again, this is a diverse group, and we make all our decisions on the basis of consensus. And I think that it's an excellent process that we go through to try to decide which plants to regulate or not. And just some of the more commonly sold ones, Russian olive. Russian olive is one of those ones that was pushed for many years as a solution to soil erosion, and also to use for windbreaks in agricultural areas. Unfortunately, it's way out of hand. It's extremely invasive, and it can really take over many different types of sites, usually more pasture type sites. It's not quite so bad in the forest. One that's just starting to become a problem in Maine is another euonymus species, Fortunae or winter creeper. It is one that will climb up trees just like the bittersweet, and it is just starting to become invasive in Maine. I know of a plant that's just down the bottom of the hill here that has really been colonizing and starting to make new babies, and it's one that definitely will probably become a problem. Creeping Charlie is one that's been around for many, many years. It's naturalized. I actually have it in my own lawn, but it is still sold as a variegated variety, and there's really no reason to continue to have this out there. It just eventually escapes and reproduces and makes babies that are like the regular Creeping Charlie and causes problems. The same thing happens with something like the Crimson King Norway maple. A lot of people say, well, I've got one of those red leaf maples, but I never see any red babies out in the woods. Well, that's because when they reproduce, they're not going to produce a red leaf variety. That is only there because that plant has been grafted onto a rootstock and provides that one particular characteristic. And that's really the only way to get it. You can't get it from seed. Once you have open pollination, what you're going to get is an entirely different plant. There are many different privets out there. There are some that are invasive and some that we have not found to be invasive. Border privet is one that we did find to be quite invasive. It has still been sold recently, and it's one that will eventually be banned. Armor silvergrass or miscanthus is one that's been used in the past, again, for kind of erosion control. It is a very beautiful grass, but it is extremely invasive and very hard to manage in areas south of us. One that's been used as a food in the past is giant butterbur or Fuki, Pedicitis japonicus. It is incredibly invasive. It grows giant leaves like elephant ears. And unfortunately, when it gets into really sensitive habitats that are out there, rare habitats, it tends to take over. So it's one that is really important to keep out of those areas. So that was the reason why this one is being banned. Christmas berry is another one. We all love red berries, and it's one that, again, might have been used in the past in ornamental wreaths and things like that. Again, another species that is very invasive in some pretty sensitive wetter habitats. I've already mentioned the Callery or Bradford pear. This became one of the most often planted trees in our urban and suburban areas. It was promoted as, being the next crabapple or whatever. Unfortunately, it never turned out to be a very good tree. It's one that is really wiped out by ice storms because of its upright growth habit. It's very easily, broken apart. It tends to not be very long lived. And I've never understood why people would want it, because it smells horrible. And then you can see here how it becomes so invasive. It really can take over any kind of a field site or even in some forested sites. So it's not a great plant, and one that will not be allowed to be sold after 2024. Another one that's been much loved in the past is European mountain ash. We have a native mountain ash that is very similar, and one that I would want to, have in my landscape if I had the right site for it. European mountain ash, unfortunately, like the Callery pear, is a very short-lived tree, has lots of problems, lots of insects that are also invasive attack it. It eventually gets riddled with borers and canker disease, and generally they almost never live to be a very old tree. Common valerian is one that's been used as a medicine, used as an herbal. It is sort of like the Himalayan balsam. It is very invasive in some of our valuable wet habitats, and one that definitely needs to be stopped being sold. There's some other plants that are part of this new set of 33 plants. Most of them are not plants that have been commonly sold. There are things like the Ulmus glutinosa, which is a little bit like our alders, that we have in wet sites. It's a European alder, very invasive, not one that we want to continue to have sold. But I'm not going to go through all of these. You can see this, and I'll this presentation is available for you through the library. Other plants that moved forward, but are often found, like right now, Ranunculus repens or the buttercup is in a lot of our lawns right now. It has been sold in the past. Ones that we don't want to have sold anymore. And then plants that have gone on the watch list. So these are ones that we don't find to be invasive yet, but we think will be invasive fairly soon. Something like the butterfly bush, the Buddleia. A lot of people love that. Right now, it doesn't tend to really overwinter that well, but just a little bit south of us, it's incredibly invasive. Same thing goes for some of the clematis plants that are out there, and Discoria plants. Those are definitely ones that are quite invasive. Others like wisteria don't overwinter well in Maine, but they are extremely invasive just a little bit south of us, as well as the Japanese tree lilac, one that's been used a lot as a street tree. Unfortunately, it has become quite invasive just a little bit south of us. And I did want to mention the Rosa rugosa. Rosa rugosa, or the beach rose, is one that has been planted widely in our coastal areas, and it does serve certain purposes. It does help to maybe prevent erosion. It's used a lot in different types of salt areas that are maybe in landscapes that are inland, where you've got parking lot salt and things like that. In the future, after January 1st, 2024, those that are selling it will have to put up signs or put tags on the plants that say that it is known to be invasive in coastal sites, encouraging people to use something like the Carolina rose instead in those sites. What's been found is that the rose tips from these, they fall off, they go in the water, they wash onto beaches that are pristine, and then get established in those pristine beaches and exclude the native plants. They've been found on a lot of the offshore islands that have never been habited, and so we know that it's an incursion. If you are looking for help in understanding how to manage these or how to identify them, there's a lot of different resources that are out there. The Maine Natural Areas Program, they have a whole gallery of invasive plants. They have a list there that is one that's not regulatory. They are keeping track of many more native plants, invasive plants that we're concerned about. So you can see a whole gallery of those. You can see their list, which they call their advisory list. So if you're concerned about things that might become invasive in the future, that's a good source of information. Go Botany is one of the Native Plant Trust sites that really is very helpful in identifying plants. There's all kinds of apps out there. A lot of people now use the Seek app to try to identify plants, so that can help you. You can always send pictures to us at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. You can send them to me. You've got my email address. You can send them through bugwatch@maine.gov. We often do ID of plants for folks. And then to find alternatives, my favorite source is the plant finder that the Native Plant Trust puts out. It's an extremely excellent website, and it's one that allows you to look at different characteristics of your soil, your sun exposure, what kind of flowering you want, spring, summer, fall, what what colors, what do you want it as a ground cover, or as a shrub, or whatever. I mean, there's so many different factors that you can put in, and it will provide you with a list of plants that are native to the ecotype that you live in. So it would be for Maine, there's a couple of different ecotypes that will allow you to figure out the ecoregion that you live in and choose plants for that ecoregion. Another one is the Native Plant Finder that the National Wildlife Federation puts out. Maine Audubon has a similar one as well, and that one can help you to choose plants that are good for butterflies and native plants that produce the food for baby birds. And then looking more specifically at control practices, there's a lot of different guides out there. Again, the Maine Natural Areas website, in their gallery, you can click on a species and it will come up with fact sheets that help you to understand how to manage these plants in multiple ways. They provide advice on pulling, they provide advice on excluding, covering over, they provide advice on using herbicides. So it's all there, as well as the US Forest Service and a couple of other groups that provide a lot of information on how to manage these invasive species. Unfortunately, for many of them, they're very, very difficult to control. And it does, in the end, make a lot of people resort to using herbicides. As long as you are doing it appropriately, following the label directions, in most situations, the risks are extremely low. But there are other ways. You can use everything from fire to just covering it over with multiple layers of cardboard and mulch and old carpets and things like that. And if you need advice on that, you can come to our office or the Maine Natural Areas program. We've got many different folks that can help out with that. And if you're considering removing invasive plants, so our rules don't require any removal of invasive plants. They just bar the sale of them. Before you remove any plant, you really need to have a plan. So you need to decide what you're going to replace it with up front. You should know what native plants belong in that area and that site, so that what you plant back into there will be happy in that site, because it may end up having to compete with those invasive plants. You may need to keep track of that site for 5 or even 10 years, because those seeds can be very long lasting and keep coming up. So you need to keep coming back and reevaluating and adapting the site to try to provide something that may help to compete with that. Somebody asks a question about what would compete with something like buckthorn. Really not a lot. Maybe something like black chokeberry, or what I showed earlier, the staghorn sumac. Those are plants that are very tough and really come in and do a lot very quickly. So with that, I will get to just a few last resources. Remember that you need to prevent these plants in the first place, because it's a lot easier to prevent them than to control them later. So don't plant them. There's a lot of resources available on maine.gov/hort, including the list of invasive plants and the new list as well. There's also things like this poster that's available out there. We have bookmarks that show some of the more common ones and what some of the alternatives might be for replacing or planting in place of those plants. This is our invasive plant website that has all the information about the rules. And if you need help with invasive plants, you can either contact me or Invasives at MNAP, which is the Maine Natural Areas Program, at maine.gov. And Kelly already mentioned these. So just as a reminder, I'll be speaking Saturday at Maine Audubon about gardening for bees and birds, gardening to please the birds and the bees. And at Bean, I'll be talking about everything from invasive plants, ticks, bugs, and jumping worms, and you name it, on July 27th. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. And I see one here. If I have invasive plants, but not wanting to use chemicals, where can I find information on what to do? Again, as I showed you, the Maine Natural Areas Program Gallery of Invasive Plants that has all kinds of tips on the individual plants and how to manage them. Everything from some plants you can pull out and keep pulling and get ahead of them. Others you're going to have to probably cover over with layers of material to exclude them that way. Others you might be able to use fire to control. There's many different ways of managing them. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people eventually get to the point where they do use herbicides. I think that the public has been basically sensitized to the use of pesticides a little bit more than needs to have happened. A lot of the problems with pesticides are things that happened when I was a child, and those have been addressed over the last 40 years. You heard that I was the manager of pesticide programs for 28 years, and I've seen the changes to pesticides over those years. And if you are tactical, especially using something like an herbicide that's applied to a cut stem, you're applying extremely small amounts to a very targeted area. You're not going to have a lot of overspray and no spray at all. And that's one of the ways to take care of some of these deep-rooted perennial plants. How do you tell the honeysuckles apart? So the invasive honeysuckles, somebody had sent a picture of one. The invasive honeysuckles, if you cut them off, they will have a hollow pith in most situations, not always. The picture that it was sent to me kind of looked like it was very light colored in the middle and probably would have had that open pith inside it if you had cut more areas. Most of the honeysuckles that you're going to see on the side of the road or out in the forest or out in a field are going to be those invasive honeysuckles. If you have any question at all about them, then take pictures and send pictures to us. There are a couple of native honeysuckles, but they're not super common.
So, Gary, if you could put on your hat for predicting the future, where are we headed? I mean, this is an issue that's seems to be getting worse, right? I mean, it's not something that we were necessarily facing, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. So what's the future hold?
Well, one of the things that I've been working on, and I'm going to be working with our commissioner on, and commissioners of the other departments that work with all of this, like the Department of Environmental Protection and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, is to suggest that we have a more comprehensive approach to invasive species in general, and do something like the state of New York has done, and recently the state of Massachusetts has had some lawmaking to basically have an invasive species council that looks at all the species that are out there and tries to set priorities on those threats that are the biggest threats to our habitats, to our wildlife, to our economy, to our agriculture, all of those areas that need to be looked at, because right now, a lot of the resources actually go right now to invasive aquatic plants, because so many people are concerned about our lakes, as I am. And that's where a lot of the political power has been. A lot of the money has been there. They're well funded through the taxes that have to be paid when you register your boat. So they get dedicated revenue for that. There is nothing like that for invasive terrestrial plants. We cobble together certain grants that we get from the U.S. Department of Agriculture or the U.S. Forest Service. Very little money available for management of these plants to assist homeowners. Most of the training and assistance has been for either agricultural operators or forestry operators, and not so much for the average homeowner. And I think that we need to have a much bigger footprint out there to look at all these different invasive species that are coming in, including, I was going to show, if I had time, emerald ash borer or many invasive fish that we have in our lakes, as well as so many marine invasives that are really creating lots of problems with our ocean habitats. So I'm hoping that we can get a larger spotlight on it, a better process of prioritizing, and also, like they have in New York, maybe some regional groups that can look at specific problems in certain regions, because some of these are regional. There's bigger problems in York County than there are in Aroostook County, or there are different problems in Washington County than there are in the Western Mountains. And those regional approaches seem to be working well in New York. They really have set a good standard there. So I'm hoping to work on that over the summer and the fall. And actually, I'm pursuing a master's in planning policy and management at the University of Southern Maine, and it's going to be one of my projects for my capstone. And hopefully it'll take off and we'll get some support. But as we have such a worldwide economy, we keep importing things. It continues to be a problem. In my position, I work as the state plant regulatory official and work with the Border Patrol as well as the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And we try very hard to make sure that, as we import things, that they are not infested. But as we all know, things get by and we end up with things like, now we have beech leaf disease in Maine. We have emerald ash borer, which is, very prevalent in southern Maine. It has reached up into your area now and will probably overtake the state over the next 10 or 15 years and pretty much kill all of the ashes in the state of Maine. So it's, you're right. We need more resources and we need a more unified approach to all of these invasive species.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, I know we have a question which we'll get to in the Q&A, but while we're on the topic, you talk about this unified effort. I know that I've talked to people who are working in our town to try and clear our forests of invasives. So do you have a recommendation for them? I mean, these are typically volunteers or people who are just really trying to do the best for the town. Is there a way that, is there something that you recommend that they can do, a resource for them?
So I celebrate them. There's a lot of volunteers for land trusts and for municipalities, and there are some resources available through the Maine Forest Service for some invasive species training, as well as help with maintenance and management of them. If you go through the Maine Forest Service, I can't think of the name of the program right now, but Jan Santerre is the person that runs that particular program, and they are assisting municipalities with some of those efforts. So they might be able to get some either grants or training through that program. They can contact me and I can try to connect them with resources. We have the ability to do what's called Plant Protection Act agreements with USDA APHIS, and sometimes we can put together a plan like that. We worked with folks in Arundel a few years ago on the black swallowwort biocontrol research and help them to get a grant to do that. So there are ways that we can help out, but we really need to have something in place, like I mentioned before, where we have a concerted effort that supports those folks. Soil and water conservation districts are available out there for training, and they also can help and sometimes get grants for either land trusts or municipalities. So that's another source of help.
Excellent, thank you.
So I see the question about burning bushes, and this was one that I had before. You may not see a lot of berries on those burning bushes. There probably are some. Looking around to try to find them, you're not necessarily going to be able to see them in your area. The birds take the berries long distances away. I can assure you that burning bushes are in the forests in your area and everywhere else in southern Maine. I find them just about everywhere I go. Yes, there may be some varieties that are less likely to be invasive, and that's great, but probably eventually they're going to cross with other burning bushes that are out there, and they'll start producing more berries over time.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary.
You're welcome.
I'm looking at my cheat sheet because I was at writing down questions as you were as you were talking, and occasionally you would answer them. So I'd say, okay, never mind. Is there a booklet for libraries? I'm putting on my library hat. Is there a booklet for libraries to be able to hand out to people? Is that available for people?
Yes, so there's an excellent publication that the Maine Natural Areas Program has available for identifying the more common invasive plants in Maine, and also provides information on management of those invasive plants. So I can send you a link to where you can request that through the Maine Natural Areas Program. It's a really great, it's a book that you can take into the field as well. It's not really expensive, and I think they still have some available. They sold out of them, I think, at one time, and then had to order more.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I just would like to take a moment to thank you for this. This has been excellent. It's great to have somebody who is so knowledgeable about this, and I'm sure there was much more you could have told us.
There's a lot more. Yeah.
But but we do try to be cognizant of people's time, so I appreciate that. We are going to be offering an invasive pests program sometime in October. So stay tuned for that, everybody. And just one more comment from Diana, who says, thank you very much, Gary. I appreciate your expertise. So
You're very welcome. And I wish I was a true expert on a lot of this stuff, but I rely on my team and lots of folks here at the department and throughout the country to make this all work for us.
yeah, I'm wanting to see a bright spot for the future, but I feel like it's a big hill, a very big hill, big mountain, I should say, to climb.
It is a big mountain, and hopefully we can kind of do it a little bit at a time. And there's a lot of people that are passionate about this, and a lot of volunteers. And I think that they can be very helpful as long as they have good leadership that kind of helps to plan ahead. And as I mentioned before, if you just go out there and rip them all out and you don't have a plan to replace them, oftentimes you just get a new invasive plant coming back. So that step is extremely important.
Yeah, and actually, that was one of my questions. I know we're wrapping up, and I apologize, but I do have one question. My tendency is to want to. I have a lot of woods around my house, so I want to pull up, with general weeds. I'll toss them in the woods, but that's probably not a good idea with invasives.
Yeah, probably not, because a lot of them will just reroot. If you're going to pull them up, then ideally you want to bag them up or dispose of them in a place where they're not going to be able to reroot, and ideally not in a place where they're not already there. So if you can bag them up and get them to the landfill or something like that, that's probably the best thing.
Okay.
And not to put them into the pile of brush that may end up getting chipped up and then doled out to residents. That's another way that a lot of invasive plants get moved around. So ideally keep those invasive plants out of that pile as well.
Yeah, that's good thinking. Oh, actually, Diane, we're really slipping things under the wire here.
That's
Diana's asking, does knotweed reroot if there is not root?
Yes, knotweed will root from any part of the plant, any node. So it grows, it's called knotweed because it grows like a bamboo. And any one of those nodes that you see that, makes a section, can become a new plant.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, we will wrap it up at that. I thank you very much, Gary.
You're welcome.
This has been wonderful. Thank you everyone for attending. We will send out a link to the recording tomorrow, and have a good night.
Yep. And I encourage anybody to email me if they have questions, and I hopefully answered most of those questions that you sent ahead of time.
Excellent.
Yep.
Thank
Take
you.
care. You're
All right.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.